Okay, new video time. Today we're going to be talking about Cavardi. The first question which may come to mind is, Ashwin, why are you skipping talking about crossbows and knights in medieval war? And the fact is that they're too complicated. Crossbow Knight War is very, very interestingly terrain dependent. There's a huge mix of unit types which enters. It's the most interesting and complicated of the war types I've ever seen, and I'm simply not qualified to talk about it in any respect. I'm certainly not very qualified to talk about most of the things I talk about, but Expo Night War is completely beyond me, so I'm skipping it, and someday I'm sure somebody will petition one of the great Skirm players to talk about it, but until then, I'm not going to stick my foot in my mouth about it. As war in Civ 5 progresses to later tech eras, it becomes markedly simpler. This is due to the increased movement of typical units, both because their actual movement points increase, but also because of road speed increases and general access. The kill power that you can apply to a particular tile spikes quite badly. So the longer you go, the later you go, the less skill expression there is. This phenomenon starts with Cavardi. So our brief outline for this is we'll talk about what makes Cavardi different from the timings that come before and after. We'll talk about the units that occur during this phase and their interactions. We'll talk about the two phases of Cavardi War that occur. A little digression on the promotions that you might take during your wars. We'll have another small discussion about the importance of terrain, and then we'll wrap it up. So, what's new in Cavardi War? Cavardi War is really defined by artillery. And artillery, as you may know, is a 3-range indirect fire unit with quite a lot of firepower. What this means first is that you can push much rougher terrain with artillery than you can with, say, crossbows, because your ability to focus fire on tiles becomes much greater. This also creates more frontage. You can, on the exact same battlefield, you can get far more artillery shots off than you could get crossbow or knight shots off. What this effectively means is that artillery is much more rewarding to a production or gold advantage, because the benefits of having another artillery become much larger than the benefits of having another crossbow. Artillery can shred through most defensive positions because of this ability to focus fire. That is to say, any given tile, if you can get arty shots on it, is probably going to die. That said, defense during artillery war is not only important, but incredibly powerful. Defense doesn't revolve around holding tiles, rather it revolves around retaking tiles. So arty war is characterized by a massive reward for production, by a massive reward for good artillery positioning, and a massive reward for good recap setups. So the units of the era, typically a list here would only include cavalry and artillery, and I'm including muskets and rifles because they're pretty important to the way I conceptualize this war. So I've got a table up here. It's up enough that you can read the values if you want. The important things to look at is that the artillery is the most expensive unit that you can get your hands on with the lowest melee strength. So frontline artillery is one of the worst things you can do, and we'll talk about this a little bit more. I also want these values up so that I can refer to them in the next stage. So RD is the most expensive, cavalries and rifles are the same, and then muskets are the cheapest. And I'm not going to talk about lancers because they suck. It's a little bit unfair to the lancer, but I'm standing by it. The metric I'm going to use to analyze the trades between these units is in terms of production health. So you take the amount of production you needed to produce a unit, and then you multiply it by the fractional health loss of the interaction. So each combat interaction therefore has a net production health. For example, a cavalry costs 150 hammers. If you lose half of a cavalry's health for no reason, that's like a minus 75 production health interaction. So if we look at these values, you can see that the columns are indexing the attackers and the rows are indexing the defenders, and I've color coded the interactions here. You can see that the absolute best value you're getting is on artillery attacks. Artillery are our main damage dealing unit of the era. Our goal is always to maximize artillery shots. That's the best we can do. That said, the one trade which gets close to the value of a cavalry of an artillery shooting something is a cavalry attacking an artillery, and this is a big reason why cavalry are even built. I want to also draw particular attention to this kind of bottom right corner. Cav really suck at slamming. These guys are not good at slamming. A cav slamming a cav is obviously net neutral most of the time. The cavs are also quite bad at slamming muskets or at slamming rifles. So you can't be going around with this kind of mass cav build into somebody who's making things like muskets, rifles, etc. So just as basically reiterating what I've said earlier, but you have to have a huge amount of RD to deal all your damage. Your cavalry should be avoiding slams unless it's into specifically artillery or finishing off units. And you have to protect your artillery. So what this functionally leads us to is that we want to have as many artillery as we possibly can firing on positions, but we can't let them be exposed to enemy fire. That means we can't frontline them. And this is a big job of the cavalry and perhaps the musket. And looking at these numbers and the conclusions I've just drawn, you might think, why would you build any cavs at all? Why don't I just build artillery and have some muskets or rifles in front of them and just get all my shots off? And this transitions us into the second part of our analysis. Cav RD war can be split into two phases. The first is the positional, which is about maximizing your artillery shots and trading well for production health. The second phase is the exploitation phase, which leverages local unit advantage to take cities, kill artillery, and take more shot tiles. A typical pattern for RD war goes in the following way. You start in the position phase, where both players have approximately equal artillery and frontline. Then, over the course of this positional maneuvering, one player achieves local force superiority by extending the front, by getting more RD shots, things like this. This transitions us into the exploitation phase, where the player who has unit advantage now attempts to exploit it, tries to take cities, slam artillery, generally push the position forward. At that point, the defending player typically withdraws their line, builds a new firing arc, starts a recap war. They stabilize the front, and we move back into the position phase. How do we transition from position to exploitation? That is, how do we achieve our local force priority? We need to maximize our safe artillery shots. Remember, trading an arty shot for an arty shot is not good for us. We need to actually make more shots than the opponent does. We need front line to protect our artillery, and our goal here is to extend the front laterally. That is to say, if you're not in the direction facing your opponent, but along the sides. So you create more shots by extending the front and creating a bigger arc, rather than creating more shots by shoving in, because that would just expose you to more enemy shots. One second. In this phase, players are both typically racing to outflank each other. The winning player, in particular, will naturally form an arc, and the concentrated firepower of this arc will decrease enemy local force in its focus, and this leads the defending player to retreat. In the positional phase, frontline exists to shield your artillery. This means you don't necessarily need cavs. Forted muskets are actually better value, but you only need as much frontline as you have frontage that you need arty to cover. It's very, very typical for people to overbuild melee and get stuck with this basically useless melee, which is not enabling arty shots. It's also very typical for people to overbuild artillery and shove artillery onto tiles which they can shoot from but are no longer safe, and then become destroyed by cavs. So hitting this balance is a big part of winning an artillery war. I can tell you my general pattern, which is that I have some amount of cavalry and artillery the cavalry are covering the front, and the arty can stand behind them and shoot freely. And then as I build up more arty mass, I also build up more melee to cover the extra flanks and extra tiles I want to hold. It's generally okay for your melee units to die. Melee units just die in arty war. That's part of their job. And so you need to build at least enough to replace them, and then maybe a little more to extend the front. So let's look at some example operational goals in the positional phase of artillery war. Our operational goals may be something like road past this river so that we can put some more front line over there and then extend and create more arty shots. We might want to wrap around a particular mountain and break through the top or the bottom of the mountain, again, to claim more tiles, produce more arty shots. And finally, if we manage to maneuver around and focus fire on more units, that's a complete example of the thing we're trying to do in the positional phase. Now, the exploitation phase occurs when enemy front line is insufficiently strong to prevent forward movement by your units. This kind of occurs when you've created so much firing power along a particular arc that it's no longer safe for your enemy to stand in the affected tiles, and so they retreat. At this point, in order to create more artillery shots, you're trying to move forward rather than extend the front laterally. In the beginning of this, our goal is to punish exposed artillery primarily through cavalry slams. And this is a big reason why cavalry are an important and useful unit, because cavalry punish exposed artillery generally much better than artillery themselves do. a cavalry can cycle. You can focus down this particular tile and abuse your own roads, and the cavalry also acts as a spotter for more artillery to come in. So as the opponent's units retreat and the defender attempts to form a new line, the goal then becomes to take cities and to claim tiles again. So when you return to positional phase, you have created a stronger setup for yourself. For both of these tests, the cavalry is absolutely essential, and the artillery are only really needed to fight cities. And this phase is where your cavalry mass comes to the fore. The exploitation phase is broken out of, typically by a stalled recap war or a full defender retreat to a more stable line. Our goal in this phase is to collapse a salient or an enflankment that we've created, and then to become concave again as we move back into the positional phase. So what are our goals, our operational goals as an attacker during the positional phase? We want to lay siege to a city, possibly winning a recap war out of it. We want to kill artillery. We want to claim contested land that we can road through. So we want to claim river crossings or mountain clumps that have been vacated. Sorry, not hill clumps that have been vacated. And we want to collapse our firing arc. We want to apply as much force into the middle of the arc as possible. The defender wants to find somewhere that they are not being shredded. They want to limit frontage, so they want to create a recap war. They want to kick off a river crossing so they can create defensible terrain, and they in particular want to create a new firing arc. The artillery are always going to outvalue you long term, so you need to get your artillery into a place where they are safe and can fire. This entire dynamic a little bit goes out the window during when the rifle becomes introduced, and that's because although rifles can be killed by artillery, it takes a huge amount of artillery shots to do so, especially if the rifle is in favorable terrain to itself, if it's got good promotions. So typically what happens is that your opponent, if I have a lot of rifles, my opponent needs to expend an absurd amount of artillery shots in order to kill the rifle, and then if I have artillery shots behind me as well, I get to free fire with my arties. And one of the very typical techniques in this time period, when you have a good rifle and artillery mass, is to just shove the rifles forward. Nothing trades well attacking a rifle. And the rifle will 100% die, but it will eat a lot of shots, and it will enable the person who is shoved with the rifle to apply an insane amount of damage. And you can repeat this for as long as you need to advance a position. This is a technique which also occurs in atomic war with the anti-tank gun. I'll talk about that when I eventually get there. The answer to the rifle then becomes having rifles of your own, which prevent the opponent from just shoving their rifles in willy-nilly. And at that point, you start to stall very hard. But the rifle artillery is actually very oppressive to mere cav artillery. And there are certain civs, Bolivia, Prussia, who abuse this kind of bulky gunpowder unit together with arty very strongly. So we need a quick discussion about promotions now. I thought this section was going to be bigger than I ended up making it, but promotions they're important, but there's not that much to do about them. So double promotions are typical. On cavalry, you're generally thinking about what job is this serving. Double terrain is quite good. Double terrain beats up artillery. Double terrain trades better into muskets and calves and so on. Ambush is a better promo if you expect to see heavy cavalry fighting, if you think your opponents have a lot of calves, and ambush calves do beat up double terrain calves. Artillery, I am not a siege believer on artillery for a serious, protracted parity war. That's because artillery are already very good at shooting cities. You're generally not reaching an artillery breakpoint by taking a volley on them. So typically for artillery, I want double terrain, which allows you to hit cavalry better, hit it opposing artillery better, or terrain cover, which insulates you from the effects of enemy artillery, which are probably going to attempt to at least counterfire your artillery. The artillery, when they're safe, generally tend to rack up promos, especially if you have an experience modifier, say from honor. A double terrain already can get into March, and March is a extremely powerful effect in these kind of protracted wars. You can also get logistics is kind of a meme. It's possible given experience modifiers, and logistics already are, of course, they represent an additional shot and therefore are extremely valuable. On gunpowder units, again, typically a cavalry slamming a gunpowder unit is not going to trade well on production health, even if it's trading well in health. So on gunpowder, I really want to take terrain cover because the thing that scares me is the artillery mass. What are the effects of terrain on our artillery war? The first thing we have to talk about is that although artillery is less terrain sensitive than previous war types, it is absolutely not divorced from it. Terrain influences the shape of the concave of the arc that you make, it influences the tiles that you can reasonably shoot or slam, and it influences the captures that you can perform. All of these are essential. So the first mitigation we can do to the effect of terrain is roading. I've said this in other places, but stepping off your own roads cuts your movement by a factor of a third. It's devastating to your units. An artillery that's on your own roads can move 2 tiles, set up, and shoot. An artillery which is off your own roads cannot move at all unless it's going to sacrifice its shot for the turn. So before you go anywhere, you want to have the tiles roaded. And this is especially true during the positional phase. As you expand outward throughout your flanks, the first thing that happens is that workers show up in the road, because units off of roads tend to die. The second type of terrain that's very important for us is mountains. So mountains are very, very interesting throughout all types of war, and that's because they create weird shapes. When you have your firing arc, a firing arc becomes incredibly safe if its end becomes a mountain. The mountain is the ultimate frontline unit. It cannot be destroyed. It cannot be bypassed. So mountains will create a new ability to shoot. Artillery love hiding behind mountains. They love shooting over the mountain. A mountain in front of a city, if you get in these wars, you will start to realize that a mountain in the first ring of your city towards the enemy is a liability. It limits your ability to maneuver your own units around, and the artillery are going to fire over that mountain regardless. So this is a good exercise for anybody who's watching this and is curious about the effects of terrain, is load into one of your own games, look at one of your cities and think, A, is this defensive from artillery? B, how would I defend if artillery were shooting me? Would I have to recap? Or is this city actually a good place to make a stand in front of it? The third important type of terrain is the river. And rivers are really important because of how they limit the movement of cavalry. They're most useful during the defense side of the exploitation phase, as they stop the attacker from pressing their advantage, and the river also tends to create a strong recapture setup. Rivers are much, much more defensive than mountains are. So in in order to break through a river, you often need to deploy serious citadels or have rifles or just walk around it. Certain river lines are death to artillery pushes. We also have to mention generaling. Generals should be deployed very carefully because if you're at on general parity and you use citadel and your opponent counter citadels, you're down 2 citadels. You haven't claimed serious terrain and you're getting damaged by citadels. So you want to deploy them either on tiles you already control in order to enable more road movement. You want to deploy them to counter general your opponent's bad generals. You want to deploy them to save yourself in the truly most desperate situations. Or you want to do it to get across a river to enable some capture. Generaling without units to support to support and claim the tiles that you've taken is an incredibly common error. There's no reason to general into tiles that your opponent is standing on unless you've got some insane mass coming through, especially if they're just going to counter general you. So there should probably be a generals video now that I'm thinking about it. So what are our conclusions from this? Arty War is really about maintaining a good mix of frontline and shots. I think about my frontline as being something that enables my artillery shots. So I don't build frontline until it enables more artillery, or unless I have to save the front that I have. It's about recognizing what tiles are safe to stand on, what tiles you can hold, what tiles you can't hold, which tiles your opponent will get destroyed on. It's also about recognizing when you need to transition between a static, slowly moving positional phase, which is about maximizing artillery shots, into a fast-moving, high-trading exploitation phase, where your cavs are running in and trying to do as much damage as possible. And the last thing is that artillery war is incredibly bloody. It's one of the most high tempo, high unit loss, high city loss war eras of the whole game, maybe only rivaled by stealth bombers. So you're gonna lose units and you're gonna lose cities, and in parity wars, these things just happen. Again, if there are any comments, leave them underneath the video. I'll get to them as soon as possible. And I'm not really sure where I'm going to go next with this video series. There's a few options. I could talk about defense. I could talk about modern atomic war, which is obviously a topic near and dear to my heart. There's a kind of mini topic, which is examinations of planes. And the other thing that would be really good to do is to do an Arty War video review, because so I don't have any VODs on hand of very serious like parody artillery wars, and this is kind of because Weevy does not tend to have these, and neither does Skirm. So artillery is kind of a free-for-all timing, and I haven't seen one of these true knockdown drag out Arty wars in quite a while. But if you're one of these players who watches this and you have like a serious parody Arty war you want to submit, I would love to go in and be able to look at it and talk about how to implement some of these ideas that have been brought up in this video, because this video is very, very terribly example low. There were a lot of players of yesteryear, players like, in particular, Hoi Polloi, who were true artillery masters. You'd see them go artillery every time that they thought their game wasn't going so great, and they were creating firing arcs, they were just grinding people out. It's an incredibly deadly timing, but current meta doesn't seem very friendly to this sort of approach. Regardless, so we're coming up on the 30-minute mark. This has actually been a very long video. Yeah, leave a comment, let me know. I'll see you all later.